Do you have something I could stand on? I really feel so short. Oh, there's a little box back here. Oh, that's better. Hey friends, it's Sam from DIY Huntress, and today I'm gonna show you how I made not one, but 2 counters for the retail store build out. Let's get started. I was just so short when I stepped off that box. All right, friends, let's start at the very beginning. So a few weeks ago, I shared episode 1 of this commercial retail build out that I am doing. My other half is actually opening his very own brick and mortar bike shop and following some serious small business owner dreams. So if you missed all of the information on that announcement, you can check out that video on my channel. I will link it below this video for you to watch. But in episode 1, we actually installed a gigantic faux brick accent wall along the entire side of the store. It was a lot of work, but it was so worth it, and it looked pretty epic. But now that that phase is complete, it is time to move on to some other projects that I can finally share in this space, starting with something that may look very familiar to my crew that follows me on Instagram. Back in August, I shared this little rendering on Instagram of this front counter that I wanted to create for this bike shop space, and overall it is pretty accurate, and I was able to stick to a lot of this design plan for this build with a few changes here and there, but we'll tackle them as we go. But I'm gonna be real with you, this project was actually pretty stressful for me because of all the things my other half asked for in this shop space. This front counter with a live edge top was the one thing that he was so hooked on, and I wanted to make it perfect. So starting with this rendering was an absolute lifesaver on this project. That being said, let's tackle this build. While this counter looks awesome, it's honestly a pretty simple build frame-wise. I actually built the entire frame out of 2x4s that I was able to bribe my brothers to help me bring into my workshop from my truck on probably the hottest day in August. Hi. So typically, majority of my builds are made from lumber that are purchased at the big box store or my local home improvement store. And what I do for basically every single project whenever I'm working with lumber from my home improvement store is I start that project, or at some point in the project, I actually square up the end. So 99% of the time, you're gonna find lumber from the box store that is not perfectly square on the ends, which means that this end is like a little crooked. But when you're building things, it's really important that everything is square. So typically, you would do, or I would do in this situation, is before I even cut my piece, I would cut off this end of the lumber to square up the edge. However, because my shop is so small and I'm usually working with 8-foot pieces, it's really hard for me to like maneuver things around. I can move my miter saw because it is on wheels, but then I don't have like clearance to move things around, whatever. So in order to eliminate that, I have a little trick. And what my trick is that I will measure out what I need for the piece. So for instance, I'm about to cut a 42-inch tall leg for the cabinet. Instead of measuring 42 inches, I'm gonna measure about 42.25 or 42.5 inch, cut that on my saw, flip this piece around, and then I'm gonna cut the extra 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch off the end to square up the end. And now that way I will have a perfectly square leg to use for this cabinet. If I had a bigger shop, then I would actually start my cut by cutting this first, measuring 42 inches, cutting again, same exact thing. I'm just doing things a little bit out of order, which is like tends to be the Sam way actually, but I'm yielding the same results. So I'm gonna get started by cutting a little more than I need to, flipping the piece and cutting the end, and then I'll have a perfectly square leg. That's my little explanation for the day. There are a lot of pieces to cut now, so let's get started. So yeah, you get it. Lots of pieces to cut on the miter saw, and I wanted to make sure that everything was perfectly square so that nothing would wobble and everything would fit perfectly together, especially since we had already picked out the slabs for this counter, and I wanted to make sure that every single measurement was as perfect as possible because I am building this without having the slabs since the slabs were being prepped by our local slab dealer. That being said, I am not going to talk specific measurements in this video because I feel like that would be way too confusing because I had to basically build what felt like 500 different types of boxes to put together to create this counter. So instead, I am going to link to plans that I created for this particular build. So if you want to build a front counter for a retail space or even just like a counter in your own home or like a bar in your basement, actually this would make a really cool bar in a basement. Anyway, I will link to the plan pans below this video so you can check them out if you'd like to. Also, side note, it looks like I'm not wearing pants. I'm definitely wearing shorts, so yeah, about that. Anyway, okay, so as you can see, I am basically building a series of different boxes to put together to create this giant counter. Now, the reason I'm creating small boxes is for two reasons. One, my shop space is super small. In fact, this counter is way bigger than my shop space. And two, I wanted to build all of this in my shop and then deliver it to the store at some point later. So by making this a module piece, I was able to get everything built, make sure everything was square using the tools that I had in my shop, and then assemble it once I got to the space. I think the biggest piece that I did end up building in my actual shop was that center display unit, because that had to be precise, but then I built all of the wings that go around that center display unit separately and then attached them all together later. In terms of building that center display unit, I cut some of my 2x4s into 2x2s in order to create the dividers for all of the shelves, and then I attached those to the display unit using wood glue and using pocket holes. Again, this is probably so much easier to see in the diagram, so definitely check that out if you're interested in building this on your own. But cutting those 2x2s not only saved a ton of money, they made my life so much easier in terms of customization. Okay, at this point I literally don't know how else to film this project while it's in the shop because it's really hot out today, and because it's hot out I have the AC on and I don't want to put the camera outside and have the doors open. This angle is gonna have to suffice right now. I'm not sure I love it, but at least you can see the whole project, right? My only goal today is to finish this, and then tomorrow I can paint and prime the first 3 sections, and then while those are drying, build section number 4, which is that L in the L shape that I'm making, and then paint and prime that. And then once that's done, I'm gonna add plywood shelves to the display case. The reason I'm adding them after I paint is because the shop owner doesn't want the shelves to be black, because a lot of the product that's going in the shelves are black, but the frame itself and the front are gonna be black. So after I paint and prime, I'm gonna install regular birchwood plywood shelves, and then at that point it's pretty much ready for delivery because it'll be too big to work on in this space anymore. So I'm gonna finish this up and then call it a night, and then tomorrow is another day. So I have the most important tool in the shop right now, Sour Patch Kids. It is so easy to get overwhelmed with a big build, especially in a small space, so I just made sure to tackle this in small parts, which is probably why it's taken me September, October, November, December, 4 months to publish this video and finally share this project. But sometimes you can only do what you can do. Okay, so once all of the sections of this display counter thing for the front of the store were done, I then turned over the actual display cabinet itself and began to route some grooves into the front of the display unit for some glass panels. Now, spoiler alert, once we got this counter into the shop and started looking at this from like a more logistical merchandising perspective, it did not make sense to have the glass display case at the front of the store, and I ended up not putting glass in this particular display case. Instead, we ended up installing glass in the display case at the back of the store, but you'll see that in a little bit. At this point, though, the front counter frames were pretty much done, so I did decide to sand everything nice and smooth, as well as hide any of those exposed-ish pocket holes using some wood filler. I then sanded everything down one more time and then gave everything a nice coat of primer before eventually moving on to painting everything flat black. Now, because I love multitasking so much, I decided to move on to cutting the plywood panels for the display cabinet while those frames dried. So I first started by breaking down a bigger sheet of plywood on my table saw into more manageable parts, and then I moved on to using my circular saw with a track to break them down into the shelves that would fit inside of that display case. And once those shelves were cut, I then installed them to the frame using some pocket hole screws, and I skipped the wood glue on this part just in case the panels ever need to be removed or replaced or fixed or whatever. But good news, friends, once those shelf panels and those side panels were installed, it was time to deliver this counter, at least the counter frame, to the store to start installing in the space. But before we get to the store in this video, let's focus on some of the behind the scenes work with today's video sponsor, Zyro. Now that the shop is ready to open, we are finally focusing on a different type of building that will really make an impact on my other half small business, building a professional and affordable website from Zyro. Zyro is a website builder that lets anyone create an awesome website and launch an online store with no coding or web design needed, which is honestly exactly what I was looking for. Legit, we started with a pre-made template on Zyro's website and have been able to customize it by swapping out the text and the images on the template with our own stuff. The drag and drop and custom color features have made it super easy to create a professional looking website for the bike shop, even with our busy schedules. Even cooler though, once the shop is complete, I can get in there, take some photos of the renovated space, and very easily drag and drop them into his new website. Not only has it been super easy to create a homepage for his bike shop, but Zyro's platform allowed us to add as many pages as we needed for the services that will be available for the bike shop, such as repairs, bike fits, and sales. And we can even set up an e-commerce page to sell items from the shop to potential customers around the country. Honestly, guys, I'm pretty tech stupid. Sometimes it takes me 10 times to figure out how to do things on the computer, and this has been such an easy process. And since Zyro's customer service is available to us 24/7 with live chat support, there is literally no way that I can mess this up, which is awesome. If you're interested in building your own website, Zyro is currently offering a pretty epic holiday sale. You can use a limited time deal to get up to 72% off and 3 months free with any yearly plan. Just use code DIY Huntress or click the link in the description below this video to start building your own website. I honestly could not recommend this service enough, and we are so excited to not only finish up this space, but also launch our official website so soon. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's finish up this build. All right, back to the build. So at this point, it was time to deliver the bases for the counters to the shop. And this felt great because it meant I had way more room in my workshop to work on other projects. And as you can see, I definitely needed some help bringing in the center pieces because they were super heavy. So right around day of install, we realized that having open shelves at the front of the store would be way better for the flow of product. So after screwing all the frames together, I made some dividers for those front shelves so that he could have storage behind the counter, as well as some room in the front for small things like nutrition, water bottles, whatever. And once that was done, I then moved on to cutting some wood siding to attach to the front of the counter to hide all of those open 2x4s and just make everything look super neat. Also, a side note, I'm going to apologize in advance because we got new lighting installed in the store around this time, and the lighting and my camera were not playing well, so the lighting gets a little strange here and there, so please bear with me. Anyway, this was one of those moments that I was like, oh man, in hindsight, because it would have been much easier to cut these openings out without having those shelf dividers in. But basically, I drilled some pilot holes and then used my jigsaw to cut out as much material as I could to make those openings for the shelves. Again, wish that I thought about this before I put those center panels in, but you live and you learn. Once those openings were made, I did get in there with my router and a flush trim bit to kind of just like cut away any of that excess leftover wood, and any mistakes that I made at that point I was able to cover up with some wood putty and with some trim. And once that front counter was pretty much done being built, I was then able to move on to the back counter, which frame-wise was built pretty much the same exact way as that front counter. The only difference here was that we did end up wanting to add the glass to the back counter, so I did have to route in those grooves on the spot. But once they were in and everything was painted and dried frame-wise, I then added some epoxy to these grooves and was able to drop in the glass panels. I was honestly so nervous about this. I thought the glass panels were gonna like fly out, but they ended up sticking so beautifully, and this thing looks so freaking cool. As the glass dried, I moved on to painting all of the siding for both of the counters. Now, since the first one had the siding attached, I painted it while it was attached, but that back counter, I pre-painted all of the siding before attaching it, and once everything was attached, I then puttied any of the seams and then painted that over as well. So once all of that siding was painted on these counters, it was time to move on to the scary part of this project, which was working with the gorgeous willowed oak slabs that we picked up from our local slab dealer called One of a Kind Live Edge Slabs. And now we picked out 3 gorgeous slabs for this project, and I knew that I had to get these things right on the first try because A, they were definitely pricey, and B, it's not like I could just go to the home improvement store and pick up new slabs if I mess up. So this part of the project definitely made me a little nervous. Luckily though, part 1 of the slab prep was pretty straightforward thanks to my amazing friends at Moss Epoxies. They actually sent me this awesome product called Crackzilla to try out, and it's essentially a 2-part epoxy in a caulking gun that comes out and cures pretty quickly. So what I did is I sealed all of the cracks that went all the way through the slab from underneath using Tyvek tape, and then I was able to use that syringe tip caulking gun type looking thing with the Crackzilla and pour it directly into all of the cracks with very minimal waste or pour over. I then allowed everything to dry overnight, sanded away any of the excess epoxy on the underside of the slabs, and then it was time for literally my worst nightmare of this project, cutting and installing the slabs. Luckily, the first one was pretty straightforward because it was just a simple straight cut. So I used my track saw to make the first cut, but the track saw was not able to get through the entire slab in one pass. So I did go back with a deeper saw after that to follow that line, and I was able to cut it perfectly to size for that back counter. That front counter, however, was a little sketchier because I did end up joining 2 of the slabs together with a miter joint, which is pretty difficult to do when you're working with 2 solid live edges and don't have a straight edge on one of the edges that you're referencing for the miter. So in order to work around this, I first started by cutting both ends perfectly square, and then once I had 2 square edges, I was able to actually set up a 45-degree carpenter square and then use that along with my track to come up with the 45-degree angle for the first slab. Perfect? Not really, but I was able to compensate a little bit later with the second slab. I'll show you that in a little bit. Now, to make things a little more complicated, because that's exactly what I wanted in this project, I did have to cut a notch out for a wall. So I measured that wall space, cut out that notch, and then we were able to basically dry fit the slab to the counter before measuring the miter from the other slab, marking where I needed to cut, and then cutting. I'm honestly pretty sure I have never been as nervous as I was to make this second miter cut, and I was literally on a reality competition on HGTV. Luckily though, everything fit super well after cutting, and I was finally able to breathe again. And I was also able to attach the slabs to the counters using brackets that will allow for some seasonal movement, but I'll link them in the description below for you so you can check them out. Very nice. Now, because I had to make a miter cut with 2 live edges, the edges obviously did not match up at the peak of the miter, so I did use my Dremel multi-tool to cut them away and then used my grinder to kind of like fake that contour or that edge and make them blend together, and it actually looks pretty natural and I'm super proud of it. We also took some time here to drill a couple of holes into the slabs to allow for some wires for all of the cash registers and credit card machines and whatever. At this point though, it was finally time to move on to finishing these gorgeous slabs, so I started by sanding everything down to 220 grit, and then I prepped the entire area for an epoxy pour because my other half really wanted these slabs to pop and I gave him what he wanted. So because of the spalting and the character in the wood, I knew that these slabs were going to soak up whatever epoxy I poured on them. So in order to prevent them from soaking up a ton of epoxy, I first sealed them in using a penetrating epoxy from Moss Epoxies. I just added a super thin coat, allowed that to dry overnight, came back the next day, sanded them down just a little bit for the next coat, and then I was able to add 1 coat of tabletop epoxy. I have tried a bunch of epoxy products, and hands down, Moss Tabletop Epoxy is my favorite. It is a 2-part system that's super easy to mix. You just mix it, pour it, spread it around. It's self-leveling, which is awesome. And then I just applied a little bit of heat to get rid of some of the bubbles. And after letting it cure overnight, that 1 coat just made such a huge difference, and these countertops were ready to go. As always though, I've linked this product in the video description below with a discount code. Definitely check it out. Oh my goodness, so there are certain projects that I look at and I'm like, I cannot believe that I built that. It looks too legit to be something that I built, and that is exactly how I feel about both of the counters in this retail space. When my other half used to dream about having his own bike shop, one of the things he used to say was he just imagined having these really cool modern live edge counters to welcome people into his store, and that is exactly what I was able to give him. I am so happy that he's happy, and I cannot wait to see these counters welcome people into his brand new space, and I cannot wait to see them filled with product in his store. That being said, I do hope that you will stick around for the full shop reveal on my channel once it is ready. This has been such a journey to be able to help my other half's dreams come true in this cool space. In the meantime though, friends, please make sure to subscribe to my channel. Click that thumbs up button if you liked this video, and I will see you all very soon for a new project. But until then, friends, happy DIYing.